You can tell a lot about the world by the way the forest sounds when you wake up. Up here, things don't happen fast. The air changes slowly with the season, creeks swell and shrink with the snowmelt, and the forest has a rhythm that doesn't care what's happening down in the cities. My name's Joel Adler, and I've worked these mountains for most of my adult life. I'm a senior ranger with the US Forest Service, stationed out of the Skycomish district, though these days I mostly patrol alone out near Huckleberry Ridge in the Cascades, about 70 miles east of anything with a stoplight. No cell towers, no traffic noise, just the timberline and a two-way radio if you're lucky. The morning it started, I got up before sunrise like I always do. Heated some instant coffee on the propane burner, stepped outside, and listened. There was still a chill in the air from the night before, but the sky was clear. No storm on the way. The trees swayed a little in the breeze. Birds were starting to chatter up in the canopy. And somewhere farther downhill, I could hear a woodpecker hammering away. A normal day. I had a decent signal on the radio and a good charge from the solar panels. That's when I picked up some chatter that made me stop and listen closer. A ranger from Mount Rainier was trying to reach his dispatch repeatedly. His voice was tight, like he didn't want to sound worried but couldn't help it. He said something about an incident at one of the lower campgrounds. Screaming overnight, blood in one of the tents, a family missing, dogs gone. Said it didn't look like a bear attack. Maybe a person. He didn't use the word murder, but that was the implication. No reply came back from his base, just silence. It wasn't my district, and the signal was faint, so I made a note and went about my routine. Refilled the rain barrels, checked the bear-proof food lockers at the trailhead, and packed my gear to head out for a maintenance sweep of the north boundary posts. I had no reason to think anything was out of the ordinary yet. Strange things happen in the backcountry. Missing hikers, wildlife kills, weird folks living off-grid. You keep your head down, log what you see, and report anything that crosses the line. The first real sign something was off came later that afternoon. I was about 7 miles northeast of my cabin near Twin Falls clearing debris off a footbridge when my sat phone chirped with a weather alert. No big deal. I get those when storms sweep up from the Pacific. But this one wasn't about weather. It was an advisory from the Washington Emergency Management Division asking all remote federal employees to be alert for abnormal medical activity in rural sectors. No details, no code, just a plain advisory. That was strange enough to stop me in my tracks. I checked the timestamp. It had gone out just after 1 p.m. I tried to pull down a data packet to see if there was more, but the signal was too weak for anything bigger than a headline. I folded the device shut and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the odd tone of it. Abnormal medical activity? What the hell does that even mean? We've had flu scares and hiker dehydration cases before, but this felt different. That night, back at the cabin, I dug out my laptop and hooked into the slow band uplink I rigged through a dish I mounted last winter. It's not fast, but on a good night, I can check emails and read headlines. Sure enough, there was something brewing. News outlets weren't saying much, but Reddit was lit up with posts from people talking about sudden outbreaks in cities. Seattle, Portland, Missoula. Hospitals overwhelmed, patients attacking nurses, quarantine orders ignored. At first I thought it was just a rehash of some other panic. Bath salts, rabies, meth psychosis. But then, I saw a shaky video from Tacoma General showing what looked like a man walking straight through traffic, ignoring broken limbs, until someone tackled him with a stretcher. That didn't look like a drug freakout. I watched the clip 3 times before the feed froze and the signal dropped. I stayed up late that night. Drank too much of the good whiskey I keep under the floorboards. Couldn't sleep. I've seen what bear attacks look like. I've handled folks who went feral during psych breaks deep in the woods. This wasn't that. There was something worse in the way those people moved. Something broken. The next day, I went to check on one of our trail cam hubs near Longtooth Pass. It's a long, slow hike uphill. Dense woods and narrow ridges that make you pay attention to every step. Most of the cams were working, but 2 had gone dark. One looked like the cable was chewed. The other, camera 12, was ripped clean off the tree. The strap was shredded, and the casing looked like it had been smashed against a rock. The sensor light was still blinking, buried in the moss. Now that's not unheard of. Sometimes bored teenagers or angry moose go after the cameras. But the placement on this one was 20 feet off the trail on a hard climb. You'd have to want to find it. I logged it, marked the location on my map, and started heading down the ridge with a feeling in my gut that I didn't want to name. That evening, I tried the radio again. No response from HQ. Just silence. I called out to other stations. Oso, Granite Falls, even Mount Baker, but nobody answered. The longer I waited, the worse it felt. Even during power failures, someone answers. I started to think about heading to the tower on Goat Rock, where we kept the emergency beacon. But I wanted confirmation first. I needed to see if anything had reached the highway or the ranger depot down in Skycomish. I left at first light the next day and hiked hard, cutting across Forest Road 6712 and making for the high overlook above Sutter's Valley. There's an old watch cabin there that hasn't been used in years, but it's got a telescope stand, and from there you can see all the way down to Route 2. I got there just after noon and trained my scope south. I could see the bends in the highway clear as day. No cars. Not one. That's when I really started to worry. Route 2 is the main artery through the mountains. Even on slow days, there's a logging truck, a service van, or a ranger unit on patrol. But nothing was moving. Not even birds in the air. I sat there for a long time, just watching. Then, through the heat shimmer rising off the pavement, I saw something strange near the bridge at Index. A man, walking alone. No pack, no gear. His arms hung loose. He crossed the road, paused in the grass, and turned around like he was waiting for something. Another figure stumbled up behind him a few seconds later. Woman or man, I couldn't tell. They didn't interact. They didn't talk. Just kept walking in the same direction, slow and heavy. That's when I knew this wasn't some isolated crisis. I headed back to the cabin and made the call, switched the beacon to full power, and tried broadcasting to every channel I had clearance for. Nothing came back, just empty static and the faint crackle of solar interference. I left it running and started gathering supplies. If whatever this was had reached the towns and roads, I wasn't going to be able to walk out to safety. I needed to hold out. I inventoried the dry food: canned beans, brown rice, powdered milk, jerky, a few sealed MREs left over from the last fire season. I figured I could stretch it 2 weeks if I rationed. There were 2 rifles in the locker. My personal bolt-action Winchester Model 70 and an old Forest Service shotgun we mostly kept for animal control. I had about 30 rounds total for the rifle and a box and a half of buckshot. The last thing I did before sunset was seal the shutters, lock the bare gates, and make a defensive ring with nails and fishing line around the outer porch. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it might give me warning. That night, I read the same online post over and over before the signal cut out. A user from Tacoma had uploaded a log of police scanner calls from the last 24 hours. Dozens of calls about biting, screaming, people refusing to stay down after being shot, streets overrun, hospitals turning people away. The last entry was a single line: "They're coming up the highway. We're heading for the hills." That line stuck with me. "They're coming up the highway. We're heading for the hills." I kept hearing it in my head as I shut the laptop and slid the makeshift shutter across the small window above my bunk. The last bar of signal had died sometime around 2 a.m., and there hadn't been a single update since. The beacon kept humming in the corner, transmitting on loop, but I was beginning to suspect no one was left out there to hear it. The isolation I'd once valued out here, the quiet, the stillness, now felt like the thing that might get me killed. I slept in shifts, never for more than 40 minutes at a time. Woke up at every creak in the walls, every gust of wind that blew a pine branch across the cabin roof. There were no obvious signs of movement outside, but my ears wouldn't stop trying to find something in the silence. A footstep in the gravel, a low grunt through the trees, a voice that never came. At sunrise, I forced myself to move. Staying in the cabin too long was going to get me soft, and I needed eyes on the valley. The battery bank on the southern ridge had been giving me low readings for days anyway. It was a good excuse to stay active. I took the rifle, filled 2 canteens, stuffed some jerky in my pocket, and locked everything behind me. I was halfway up the ridge trail by 8. The hike wasn't difficult, but it was tense in a way that I hadn't felt before. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was off. There were no signs of elk herds, no scat, no tracks. Even the squirrel nests near the hollowed cedar trunks looked undisturbed, abandoned. I checked the trail cam posts again, even the ones I wasn't scheduled to visit. Most were either non-responsive or recorded nothing but wind over the past 48 hours. Whatever was coming, it hadn't reached this high yet, or it was passing through without leaving prints. The battery shack was intact. I checked all 3 solar panels, brushed off the dust, and logged the charge manually. Nothing wrong there. I ran a short diagnostic and powered the signal booster just long enough to scan the weather band and NOAA alerts. No updates. Not a single regional signal. Even the emergency band was empty now, just carrier hum. I sat on the ridge for a while after that, drinking from my canteen and watching the ridge lines. There was usually a crow or two that circled the firebreak trail, especially this time of year when deer carcasses popped up, but today, nothing. Just clouds rolling over the valley and wind threading through the branches. Then I heard something, a faint crunch, one I couldn't explain away. It came from the tree line downslope, not a snap or a rustle, but a rhythmic thud, like boots on gravel, but heavier, not rushed, not panicked, just steady. I crouched low, scanned with the scope on my Winchester. Nothing. I held there for several minutes until a shape emerged. A man. At least I thought so at first. He was wearing a torn forest green jacket, smeared with mud. No pack, no hat. His skin looked too pale, like it had been drained. He moved with that same slow pace I'd seen in the grainy highway footage. I didn't call out. I just watched. Something was wrong with the way he moved. His arms hung loosely at his sides, swinging only when gravity made them. His gait was uneven, like a knee wasn't bending the right way, but he didn't limp. He didn't react to branches hitting his face or the slope underfoot. He just walked. Straight, deliberate, without direction. I chambered around, not because I planned to shoot him, but because my hands felt better with the rifle braced. The man didn't seem to see me. He passed within 70 feet of my perch on the ridge and never looked up once. There was dried blood down the back of his neck, and his fingernails were blackened like he'd clawed something raw. I held my breath until he was out of view. When he vanished around a bend in the trail, I exhaled slowly and started counting to 60. I reached 80 before I moved. That's when I decided I wasn't staying at the cabin anymore. I hiked fast, cut straight across the ravine slope to save time, made it back to the cabin around 2 p.m. and started packing. I took what I could carry: a full med kit, the rifle and shotgun, 3 boxes of ammo, the fire starter pouch, a weatherproof poncho, and as much food as I could jam into my old army ruck. The rest I sealed in plastic bins and buried under the crawl space with the solar radio and spare fuel tank. Maybe I'd come back. Maybe not. By 4, I was on the move again. I planned to head southeast toward Iron Goat Trail. There was a secondary fire lookout there, unused since the 90s. But if the generator worked, I could boost signal enough to reach anyone still broadcasting. More importantly, the tower gave a 360-degree view of the valley. If this thing was spreading, I'd see it coming. The sun was low when I reached Crow's Step, a narrow ridge where the trail cuts between 2 steep rock walls. I paused there, scanning again with the scope. Nothing at first. Then, movement in the distance. 6 figures walking through a clearing below, too far to see their faces, but their movements gave them away. No one was carrying anything. No gestures. No voice. They weren't hikers. They passed slowly, spreading apart as they entered the brush. One of them stopped and crouched for a moment, not like he was injured, but like he'd forgotten how to stand. Another tilted his head up toward the sky and held it there, mouth slightly open. I didn't see them again after that. They disappeared into the pines. I kept walking until dusk, found a dry spot behind a cluster of fallen cedar logs, and made a cold camp. I didn't cook, didn't speak, just sat in the dark with my back to the moss and waited. Sometime after midnight I heard gunshots. Not far, maybe 2, 3 miles west, somewhere near Forest Road 68. 4 distinct cracks. Bolt action by the sound of it. Not automatic. probably a civilian rifle. Then silence, then a scream. I didn't move, didn't even reach for the rifle. I just stayed low and listened. After that, there was nothing but wind and a soft rustle through the understory that didn't belong to any animal I'd heard before. In the morning, I found the source. A campsite just off the main fire trail, near a creek bend. There were 2 bodies. One man in his 30s, a hunter by the look of him, camo vest, boots, backpack half open with protein bars, and 308 rounds spilled out. His skull was crushed, not by a bullet, blunt force. His rifle lay snapped in the dirt like it had been stepped on. The other was a younger woman. Her throat was torn open. No signs of a blade. More like it had been bitten, torn with teeth. Her face was twisted in shock. She'd been dragged 10 feet from the campfire ring. Her fingers were broken, snapped backwards like she'd tried to claw her way free. I didn't bury them. There wasn't time. I took the rounds, repacked their first aid kit, and left a trail marker nearby in case I ever made it back with help. The world had changed. I didn't know how far the damage had spread yet, but I knew I couldn't treat this like a backcountry emergency anymore. This wasn't a rescue job. No airlift was coming, no cavalry. I was 70 miles into the wilderness with no cell reception, no road access, and only a vague sense that civilization had already lost the fight without me. I spent the next morning climbing the switchbacks that led toward the Iron Goat lookout. It was an old trail that hadn't seen much use in years. Just an overgrown fire path snaking along the high ridges east of Stevens Pass. The air up there was thinner, colder. I didn't see a soul on the trail, but I kept checking my surroundings every 20 steps. I was starting to learn the new rules of this world, even if no one had spoken them aloud. Stay off roads, avoid noise. If you see someone walking slow and silent, don't assume they're still alive. By late afternoon, I reached the base of the Iron Goat Tower. From a distance, it looked intact, but as I got closer, I could see where the base had been battered. One of the corner supports had scorch marks, maybe lightning, maybe vandalism. The hatch door at the bottom hung open, and something inside the stairwell smelled sour. Still, it was the highest point around for 20 miles, and I didn't come this far to turn back. I took it slow going up, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. Each step groaned under my weight, the old wood flexing just enough to make me pause. About halfway up, I found the source of the smell. A body, curled in the corner of a platform. Male, late 40s, judging by the weathered face and ranger uniform. The side of his neck was torn open, like something had clamped down and shook him like a rag doll. Blood had dried in a thick sheet beneath him, and flies swarmed the exposed skin. I didn't look too long. I recognized the patch on his shoulder. That was Ranger Terry Matheson. I hadn't seen him since the 2019 wildfire coordination meeting in Leavenworth. He'd been posted to a different sector. What was he doing here? I didn't find a radio on him, but I took the keys clipped to his belt and kept climbing. When I reached the top, I locked the trapdoor behind me and started inspecting the room. It was cramped, just a desk, a broken cot, and the communication console. One of the windows had been shattered, glass crunching underfoot. On the far wall, someone had scrawled a message in black permanent marker, "Nobody's coming." I switched on the solar inverter, waited for the power meter to climb. The beacon hummed, then flickered to life. I toggled through every emergency frequency I knew. Aviation, marine, law enforcement, static, a few bursts of partial signal, fragments of voices, but nothing I could understand. Just scattered noise like ghosts bouncing off dead satellites. As night fell, I took inventory. The storage locker had one sealed ration box, 3 bottles of water, a flare gun, and 2 rolls of emergency thermal wrap. No batteries, no medical supplies, and no extra fuel for the generator. I pulled the chair up against the wall and sat down, trying to piece together my next move. I couldn't stay here, not without food or ammo resupply. I had to think long-term now. Every choice I made could get me killed. Around midnight, I saw the fire. It was far to the west, maybe 10 miles out, flickering just above the horizon. It wasn't natural, controlled, pulsing light, like someone had set a building or large campsite ablaze. But what struck me most wasn't the flames. It was what I saw moving around them. From that distance, I couldn't make out shapes clearly, but dozens of dark figures circled the fire, slowly, almost rhythmically, like moths that didn't burn. I didn't know if they were alive or not, but they weren't trying to escape the blaze. They were gathering. I turned away and went back to the console, tried the radio again. Still nothing. No calls, no signals, no aircraft chatter. I sat back in the chair and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. In the morning, I made my decision. I would head south. There was a ranger airstrip near Keechelus Lake used for supply drops and medevac flights. It was rough terrain, but I could reach it in 3 days if I stayed off the known trails. If the government was still flying helicopters anywhere, it would be there. Even if no one was left, I might find fuel, supplies, something. Staying in the tower meant dying in a room with no exit plan. I left a note on the desk just in case. Wrote down the date, my name, and my planned route. Not for rescue, just so someone would know I didn't give up without trying. I climbed down, avoided looking at Matheson's body again, and hit the trail with full gear. My rifle was cleaned, my last 6 shotgun shells sealed in a waterproof pouch, and I kept the flare gun strapped tight to my belt. The southern path wasn't maintained anymore, just a game trail that snaked through overgrowth and scree fields. But I'd mapped it in my head 100 times before. If the forest didn't turn against me, I could make it. On the second day of hiking, I reached the old fire break overlooking Bitter Hollow. The forest had thinned out there due to past burns, which meant I had visibility, but less cover. That's where I saw my first real group of them. They came through the tree line without sound. Maybe 15 of them, men and women, all ages. Some missing arms. One dragging what was left of a leg behind her like it didn't matter. Their clothes were stained, torn open in places. Most looked like they'd been attacked days ago, but they kept moving forward. No talking, no moaning. Just that same hollow shuffle I was starting to recognize. I dropped behind a log and stayed still. They didn't look up, didn't sniff the air. But when one of them passed over a patch of crushed pine needles where I'd walked an hour earlier, he stopped and crouched. He reached down, pressed his hand into the soil, and slowly turned his head like he was listening. Then he stood back up and kept walking with the others. They didn't see me, but they knew something had been there. I waited 30 minutes before I moved again. By the third night I was exhausted. I'd made it across the eastern bluff and down into the ravine below Cougar Rock. The trail here was nothing more than a tangle of roots and loose stones. I found a small cave under a granite outcrop and set up a cold camp. Ate 2 strips of jerky, checked the ammo again, and wrapped my jacket tighter against the dropping temperature. The sky was clear, stars brighter than usual. You'd never guess the world was falling apart just by looking up. I was almost asleep when I heard the helicopter, low, slow, twin rotor by the sound. Civilian, not military. It passed overhead without a spotlight heading west. I scrambled out of the cave and waved the flare gun, but I knew it was too far. No one was looking for me. That flight wasn't a rescue mission, it was an escape. I watched the blinking light fade into the distance and realized something that made my stomach sink. That chopper wasn't flying toward help, it was leaving help behind. By dawn, I was close to the airstrip. When I broke through the tree line and saw the control shack in the distance, I almost let myself believe it might still be safe. But the wind changed, and I smelled smoke. Not wood smoke, plastic and oil, the kind that comes from engines left burning too long. The tarmac was blackened. A helicopter lay sideways in the grass, half melted from a fire. 3 trucks were parked near the tower, but their tires had been slashed, and the doors hung open. I didn't see bodies at first, then I spotted them. Drag marks leading to the ditch. Bloodstains dried to rust in the gravel. I moved slowly, rifle up, every step deliberate. I checked the trucks. Nothing usable. Radios gutted, gear looted. The control shack was worse. Inside, someone had barricaded the door with a desk, then been torn out from the inside. Claw marks on the floor. No one left alive. I didn't leave right away. I sat on the hood of one of the wrecked trucks for the better part of an hour, watching the sky, hoping to hear another rotor or see a contrail high above the ridgeline. But there was nothing. No movement, no voices, No wind strong enough to stir the flag still hanging from the airstrip's entry post. Even the flies had moved on. I went through the hangar one last time before leaving. Most of it had already been picked clean. Survival gear, radios, medkits, all gone. I did find one thing. A rolled-up canvas satchel tucked under a bench. Inside was an old USGS topographic map marked with grease pencil notations. Someone had circled areas in red, a dam station near Caches Lake, an emergency shelter built into a ranger outpost further southeast, and what looked like a decommissioned communication site in the Teenaway backcountry. No names, no notes, just circles and small arrows pointing toward them. Maybe they'd been heading there. Maybe they never made it. I added the map to my pack, stripped what wiring I could from a ruined flight console, and made one last sweep for usable fuel. No luck. Whatever hadn't burned in the fire had been drained, probably by the same people who slashed the tires. I wondered if it had been panic or cold logic that drove them to it. Either way, they'd made sure no one else was getting out that way. By late afternoon, I was cutting back through the forest, heading southwest. I took an indirect path, away from marked trails and fire roads. If there was even the smallest chance someone, or something, was tracking me, I didn't want to leave a straight line. I moved slow, double-backing every half mile, wiping down branches, stepping across stone instead of soft ground when I could. It felt paranoid at first, but when I saw what was left of the camp near Elk Grove Creek, I knew I wasn't overreacting. They'd pitched 3 tents, looked like a family, 2 adults and at least 1 kid based on the clothing and small boots half buried in the mud. There were no bodies, not anymore. But the scene told its own story. A cooler was smashed open. A trail of red dragged from the campfire ring down toward the water. A set of bloody handprints streaked across the flap of the largest tent. Something had happened fast. No signs of a fight, no defensive perimeter, just chaos and then silence. I didn't linger. I took a sealed bottle of iodine drops from one of their packs and kept moving. The sun was going down fast, and I didn't want to be anywhere near that ravine after dark. That night, I set up camp under a rock overhang behind a thicket of spruce trees. I didn't light a fire. Instead, I used the red lens on my headlamp to check my bearings and reviewed the map under the canvas of my jacket. The dam site wasn't far, maybe 20 miles as the crow flies, but with the terrain, I figured it'd take 3 days minimum. The map showed a few old maintenance access roads that snaked along the riverbeds, but they hadn't been maintained in decades. Still, it was a direction, and I needed that more than anything now. I barely slept. The forest had changed again. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. The air felt heavier, like something had seeped into the soil and was spreading without sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps passing along the ridge above my camp. Not animals. Too slow, too even. I stayed still, covered myself with a thermal sheet, and let my breath shallow. I didn't hear them stop. Didn't hear them sniff. They just moved through and vanished. I waited until first light before I dared to move. The next day, I pushed hard. My knees ached from the incline, and my shoulders burned from the pack weight. But I kept my pace up. The isolation was beginning to wear on me. When you're alone for too long in dangerous country, your mind starts filling the silence with things you don't want to hear. Your own voice doubting everything. The memory of things you should have done differently. At one point, I caught myself talking aloud, narrating my own trail decisions like I was explaining them to someone else. I had to stop and sit for a minute just to center myself. Around midday, I spotted smoke, thin and white. No signs of a large blaze. Controlled, possibly a campfire. I didn't rush. Instead, I circled wide around the valley and climbed a rise to observe from above. I found them an hour later. 2 men, both armed, both in dirty work uniforms. Private logging company, judging by the patches. They were cooking something in a small skillet over a propane flame and talking in low voices. I couldn't hear the words, but I watched their hands. One of them kept checking his rifle. The other never stopped scanning the woods. I debated for a long time whether to approach. In the end, I chose not to. They didn't look sick, and they didn't look like the wandering things I'd seen before. But they didn't look friendly either. The world had tipped too far. Trusting strangers out here didn't feel like a good gamble. I moved on, giving their camp a wide berth and staying downwind. I knew how to move quiet. They never saw me. By nightfall, I'd made it to a high bluff overlooking a drainage basin near Big Cougar Creek. I could see the edge of the dam facility in the distance, part of the old power grid built back in the 60s. It had been largely decommissioned but still showed up on my maps. I'd never visited it in person. It looked intact from here. No smoke, no fires, no movement. The final stretch took me through a dried-out riverbed, thick with blackberry bramble and sun-bleached tree stumps. I caught my sleeve on the thorns 3 times, had to cut myself free once. As I approached the dam service road, I started to see more signs of life. Abandoned gear, torn tarps, boot prints in the dry mud. Not fresh, but recent enough. Someone had tried to hold this place. Whether they succeeded, I'd find out soon enough. I reached the chain-link perimeter fence just before dusk. One gate had been busted open, not with tools, more like it had been rammed, then forced the rest of the way by hand. The steel links were bent outward, like something had pushed through with unnatural strength. That set my nerves on edge. I took the long way around and entered through a breach on the east side. Inside the compound, everything was dead quiet. I moved through the control yard with my shotgun at the ready. The place was built like a Cold War relic. Thick concrete walls, rusted stairwells, old generators half covered by ivy. No lights, no hum of machinery. Just a wide, yawning silence that swallowed my footsteps. Then I saw the signs of a fight. Spent casings littered the walkway, a cracked hard hat. Blood pooled near the stairwell that led to the maintenance corridor. Someone had tried to hold this place. It hadn't gone well. I entered the control room cautiously, checking each corner before I moved in. No bodies, just the smell of old rot and mildew. Someone had spray-painted a message on the far wall. We barricaded the lower floor, "Do not open." The door beneath the sign had been nailed shut with boards and twisted wire. I didn't go near it. Instead, I checked the radio console, found the emergency transceiver offline, likely fried during the fight. But next to it, tucked in a metal file box, was a notebook, scrawled entries, times, dates, notes about incoming refugees, food inventory, water checks. The last entry simply read, "We heard them in the vents. They're not people anymore." I left that place at sunrise. Didn't touch anything. Didn't call out. Just backed out slowly and didn't stop moving until the trees swallowed the dam behind me. Once I was a quarter-mile out, I allowed myself to breathe properly again. Not because I thought I was safe, but because there's a point where your body starts making the decisions for you. My shirt was soaked through, not from the heat, but from the way I'd been tensing every muscle for the past hour. I didn't look back. If something came out of that structure, I wouldn't outrun it. Better to keep eyes forward, rifle ready, and stay quiet. I kept moving south by southwest, avoiding open areas and fire roads. My next goal was the Ranger substation up near Mineral Ridge. It was an old prefab used for seasonal housing and gear storage. More importantly, it had its own water catchment system and a diesel generator if I could get it running. I didn't expect to find people. I wasn't even sure I wanted to. But I needed rest. Not just to sleep. I needed stillness. Somewhere I could sit with my back to a wall. Somewhere I could boil water and eat without my rifle leaning against my thigh. The terrain was steeper on this leg. Most of the trail had been reclaimed by nature, and downed trees forced me to detour constantly. I started rationing water. I still had purification tabs, but every refill meant finding a creek that wasn't fouled with rot or runoff. The streams I passed now were still quiet, too quiet. Even the frogs were gone. The only sounds were wind and the occasional shift of a branch under weight I couldn't see. I stopped that night in a dry gully between 2 ridges and set up a small camp against a fallen spruce trunk. No fire as usual. I'd learned not to cook anything with a strong scent, so I ate dry oats mixed with a splash of iodine-treated water. A meal that stuck to your teeth and felt like nothing in your stomach. I lay down with my jacket pulled tight and tried not to listen to the forest, but it didn't matter. Around 2 in the morning, something passed through the trees above me. It didn't speak. It didn't grunt, but the sound of its movement told me everything I needed to know. 2 sets of feet, slow and out of sync, dragging more than walking. I didn't move. I had my shotgun across my chest, one hand on the grip, thumb already on the safety, but they didn't come down the slope, just passed above me. Never in a straight line, more like a lazy spiral, circling something they couldn't quite locate. I stayed motionless for over an hour after they were gone. Not sleeping, just waiting. My eyes tracked every shadow in the canopy. When dawn came, I left that place without packing. Just stuffed everything into the rucksack and hiked until the blood returned to my legs. By late morning, I reached the ridge above the mineral substation. It sat in a shallow, bowl-shaped clearing about the size of a football field, surrounded on all sides by dense fir and pine. From the tree line, it looked untouched. No movement, no smoke. I glassed it for 15 minutes before I moved in. The front porch was intact, windows unbroken. The diesel tank was dented from some old impact, but sealed. I didn't relax. Not really, but I did breathe easier when I stepped inside and found the main room empty and dry. It was clear someone had been there recently. Gear was missing, dust trails showed what had been taken, but there were no signs of violence. No blood, no barricades. Whoever had come through wasn't running. They were preparing. The place still smelled like old wood and heating oil. I checked the corners, cleared the storage room, then locked the door behind me and lowered the blackout shutters. It was the first time in a week I felt something close to sheltered. I stayed for 2 nights. First day I boiled water, rotated through short naps, and inventoried everything. They'd left behind a bundle of old maps, a medkit with burn cream and gauze, a half-full case of sealed crackers, and one nearly depleted satellite uplink beacon. The beacon was the most valuable. It still blinked when I powered it up. No way to transmit voice, but I could ping coordinates if someone out there was still logging signals. I marked my location and sent the beacon burst. Then I waited. Nothing came back. On the second night, I heard someone outside the walls. It started around 3:00 a.m. A low scrape against the eastern wall, followed by silence. Then another scrape. Not frantic, not like someone pounding for help. Just a slow drag, like fingers testing the structure. I stayed in the dark, sitting against the supply cabinet with the shotgun pointed toward the door. The scraping stopped after a few minutes. I waited another hour before I dared look through the peephole. Nothing there, no footprints in the dirt. But something had smeared blood across the edge of the porch. It was fresh. At first light, I moved again. I didn't even finish packing. Just loaded what I could into the frame and left the rest. I'd stayed too long. Whatever was following me didn't move like a predator, but it didn't move like it forgot either. These things, they didn't search like people, but they didn't wander blind either. There was intent, even if it was buried under the rot. I headed east now, toward the edge of the Wenatchee backcountry. There were a few old bunkers out there, Cold War installations that had been sealed since the Reagan years. Most were likely stripped to the concrete, but 1 or 2 might still have utility access or an intact water system. I'd seen them on aerial recon sheets years ago when helping with fire line projections. No one talked about them anymore, but I remembered the coordinates. The route was rough. Long ridges, exposed slopes where I had to crawl flat across shale to avoid being seen. Twice, I had to double back when I spotted movement on distant switchbacks. Groups of infected, maybe 6 or 7 at a time, never moving quickly, but always in that same directionless persistence. I saw a buck once, an actual healthy deer. First wildlife I'd seen in days. It watched me from the edge of a clearing, then bolted into the trees without a sound. Smart. Animals knew something was wrong long before we did. I found the entrance to the old government shelter just before dusk on the 4th day. It was a low concrete structure built into the side of a granite slope, covered in moss and treefall. If I hadn't been looking for it, I would have walked right past it. The front hatch was rusted shut, but I managed to break through a vent panel and crawl inside. It was dark, damp. The air smelled like old batteries and mildew, but the walls were thick and the interior rooms were cool and dry. I found storage lockers, an old radio cage, and rows of bunks stripped bare. No food, no weapons, but no signs of struggle either. It was just empty, forgotten. That night, I finally slept, deep for hours, without waking. No footsteps outside, no wind, no hunger, just the concrete silence of a place built to outlast a different kind of war. The next morning, I opened one of the old logbooks stored in the command locker and found notes from decades ago. Most were routine entries, but the final one, dated in faded ink, stuck with me. It simply said, "If they ever reach the mountains, it means the cities are gone." I read that line 3 times, then closed the book and sat in silence for what might have been an hour. I wasn't sure whether the author had written it during the Cold War, expecting missiles or foreign troops, or if someone had added it later, quietly aware of the same creeping end I was now watching unfold. Either way, the message was clear. There wasn't anything to go back to. Not Seattle, not Olympia, not even Skycomish. They were either ash, abandoned, or infected. For a while, I just walked the length of the shelter, room to room, making note of every sealed vent and welded hatch. Some corners still had mildew stains in the concrete, and the smell of damp copper hung in the air from old circuitry, but the place held. It wasn't comfortable, but it was a fortress compared to a tarp and a bolt action in the woods. I marked every entry point, set up tripwires from leftover utility cord, and blocked the weakest hatch with a metal cabinet and a bin of gravel-filled rebar I found in the storage hall. The world outside could have its collapse. In here, I would buy myself time. Over the next 3 days, I worked, cleaned what I could, set up water catchment using a rusted pipe feeding down the slope. It wasn't clean, but with iodine and patience, I had something drinkable. I stripped down the emergency beacon, reconfigured its burst code to transmit a simple loop. USFS Ranger Joel Adler, shelter intact, mountain stable, do not approach unless uninfected. I didn't expect anyone to hear it. I just needed to send something, leave a mark. I guess it's a thing we do when everything else is disappearing. Try to make proof that we were here. I kept to a schedule, wake with the sun, check the perimeter, ration supplies. I hunted when I could, squirrels mostly, maybe a grouse if I got lucky. Most of the large game had moved east or gone quiet. I didn't see any elk, and that bothered me more than it should have. If the animals were running, there was a reason. Sometimes I could go 2 days without seeing anything that walked upright. Then, without warning, a group of them would pass within 20 yards of the bunker's southern slope. Always the same slow shuffle, the same blank stares, and blood-matted clothes. The way they never tracked scent or sound properly, but somehow still turned toward heat or movement. It got under my skin, like they were drawn to memory instead of instinct. One night, maybe 2 weeks in, I saw something different. I was up near the observation slit I'd cleared at the old ventilation tunnel. I used it to monitor the tree line. The moon was full, and I could make out clear shapes across the upper ridge. A group of infected were crossing the rock field, 4 or 5 of them, and then one stopped. It didn't just stop and stare like the others had. It crouched. It picked something up from the ground, a branch, and dragged it across the gravel behind it. Not random, deliberate. I couldn't see what it was drawing, but the motion was intentional. It shook me. I stayed behind the wall until dawn. After that, I made the decision to move again. I knew the shelter wasn't permanent. It bought me a window to think, to rest, but not to live. If even some of them were beginning to exhibit pattern behavior, anything beyond basic directionless wandering, then staying in a fixed location was asking to be found. I didn't care if it was 1 in 100. That one was enough to doom you. I packed light, took only what I could carry for a fast trek. The beacon stayed behind, buried under stone and sealed in a plastic case. If anyone ever found it, they'd find the message. I left behind the name, the date, and a map to the ranger outposts that still might have unbroken doors and clean water. My next heading was toward the old hydro project out near Lost Lake. Last I heard before all this, a couple seasonal volunteers had been using the pump station to store gear. It was remote, high elevation, and hard to reach without knowing the trails. Perfect for staying unnoticed. If anyone else thought the same way, maybe they'd be there. Or maybe it was just another dead zone. I'd find out either way. I set out early and took the ridge route, sticking to elevation to maintain line of sight and avoid bottlenecks. The terrain was brutal, Thorns tore at my jacket. Slopes forced me to slide down scree on my side more than once. But I kept moving. I didn't rest longer than 20 minutes at a time. I passed 2 more campsites during the hike, both ruined, both empty. At the second, I found bones, not old ones, cleaned too thoroughly to be animals. I didn't linger to figure out what had happened. I moved faster. Late afternoon, near the edge of a frozen tributary, I finally saw proof I wasn't alone. A column of smoke drifted from beyond the ridge. Thin, blue, slow burning. Someone with experience. You don't build a fire like that if you're panicking. You do it if you know how to ration heat and hide light. I took out the scope and scanned carefully. It took nearly an hour, but I spotted the outline of a person. No movement at first. Then a slow shift. Sitting next to the fire. Guarding it. They had a rifle across their lap. A parka with a Forest Service logo. I couldn't see the face. Didn't try to call out. I waited until full darkness, then circled north and made camp out of sight. I didn't want to startle whoever it was. I didn't even know if they were uninfected. In this world, you verify before you speak. You observe before you approach. The fire burned until midnight, then went dark. By sunrise, they were gone. I checked the site later that day. Just ash and a few tracks. No signs of a fight. Whoever it was, they moved with discipline. They left behind no food, no gear, not even a scrap of cloth. Like they'd never been there. I stood in that clearing a long time, watching the trees, half expecting to hear a voice. But none came. The thing is, that brief glimpse, just knowing someone else was out there doing the same thing I was, it stayed with me. It told me that the instinct to survive hadn't vanished, that even with cities gone, power lost, government erased, there were still people out there who weren't giving up. Not to fear, not to hunger, not to whatever walk now, where families used to camp. I don't know how long this world will last. I don't know how far the infection has spread, but I know the mountains haven't fallen yet. The trees still stand, the wind still speaks in the canopy, and there are still a few of us, rangers, loners, survivors, moving quietly in the shadows between collapse and what comes next. We don't call for help anymore. We don't wait for orders. We endure. Because sometimes, survival isn't about fighting. It's about listening to the silence, trusting the land beneath your feet, and knowing that even when the world ends, the trail keeps going.